Hey guys, tonight we slide beneath the sheets of time and tiptoe into the flickering glow of a Roman villa where the air smells faintly of olive oil and wet stone and the hearth still smoulders from the morning's ritual. You reach out, your fingers brushing the carved edge of a fire bowl because if you were a new bride in ancient Rome, you'd better get your flame from the right place, otherwise the gods might just ruin everything. Yes, you're getting married. You're wrapped in a saffron-colored veil that itches at the ears, your sandals feel stiff from new leather, and everyone keeps reminding you not to trip on your way into the house. Why? Because every movement is a symbol, and every step of this strange Roman wedding is thick with meaning, some sacred, some downright bureaucratic, and others surprisingly tender. Your ceremony was called confariatio, which already sounds like a sneeze, and it involved a sacred cake made of spelt. You and your husband had to share it in front of the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's top religious official, while 10 witnesses awkwardly hovered nearby. Spelt, by the way, was considered a purifying grain, toasty, nutty, also dry. Good luck swallowing it while a priest watches. But here's the twist. You couldn't just waltz into your new home and light a candle. No, that first fire had to be carried from your father's hearth, transported in a special container or torch to your new husband's house. This symbolic transfer of flame was believed to carry your family's protection, legacy, and divine favor. Forget the flowers, this was your real bridal bouquet. Historians still argue whether this ritual was a genuine religious necessity or simply one of many superstitions the Romans used to smooth over the terrifying instability of marriage. After all, women in Rome were expected to leave behind their entire identity and fold themselves into a new household under the manus, or legal control, of their husband. The fire at least gave them something to hold on to. Now imagine the scene. You approach the door of your new home, stepping over the threshold with exaggerated care. You're not allowed to say a word. A group of matrons greets you, not with hugs, but with carefully rehearsed chants and offerings. Someone hands you a wool spindle, symbolizing your future spinning duties, and another woman dabs your cheeks with perfume. You are, for all intents and purposes, becoming a living emblem of domesticity. The fire you carry is placed reverently in the household hearth, and you kneel beside it. This, technically, is your new mother. The goddess Vesta, guardian of the home, lives in the fire. If it goes out, well, maybe your marriage will too. This wasn't just quaint tradition. The hearth in Roman homes was sacred. It had to burn continuously, and it represented not just physical warmth, but spiritual presence. If you lit your marriage on the wrong spark, or worse, forgot the ritual entirely, you were asking for a curse. And here's where things get stranger. If your husband died and you wanted to remarry, you sometimes had to go through an entire cleansing process just to remove the original fire's influence. Otherwise, Roman thinkers warned, you might accidentally summon a ghostly husband into your new bed. Romantic, huh? Oh, and don't forget, you likely didn't choose this marriage. Marriages were arranged between families, often to solidify political alliances, boost social standing, or just get rid of a surplus daughter. Love. That was something you might develop later, if you were lucky. Maybe. But even in this rigid framework, odd little details hint at human softness. Brides sometimes whispered quiet prayers to Juno Pronuba, asking for peace and kindness. Grooms might slip a gift beneath the wedding couch, a simple token, a carved charm, maybe even a small doll to remind you of childhood now fading behind you. Want another quirky tidbit? In some regions, brides weren't just carried over the threshold for fun, they had to be, because stepping over the doorframe was considered risky. It was believed that the boundary between outside and inside was a liminal space, a place where spirits lingered. And if you stumbled, oh boy, you might doom the union entirely, so your husband picks you up. Not exactly a swoon-worthy Hollywood lift, more of an awkward grunt and shuffle, but the symbolism is clear. He's carrying you into a new world, one you didn't quite choose, but must now make your own. Let's be honest. You probably wouldn't survive this as a modern bride. Between the cake of dry grain, the mandatory silence, the fire logistics, and being transferred like a legal document, the whole ordeal feels less like a wedding and more like a real estate transaction with flowers. Still, there's something quietly poetic in it all. A girl carrying fire from her childhood home, stepping into a strange new life, watched by women who once did the same. The crackling flame may not say much, but it listens. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You kneel by that Roman hearth, hands still warm from the flame. But beyond the smoke, stranger marriage customs await. You're still blinking against the smoke from the Roman hearth when the shadows around you begin to change. Stone walls shift to timber and plaster, and the air grows damp with the scent of moss and hearth ash. Outside, church bells toll, low and slow. You're in a medieval village now, somewhere between sheep pastures and thatched roofs, and tonight, your marriage is not a private affair. No, tonight everyone is invited, not just to witness the vows, but the next part too. You lie on a wooden bed, scratchy linen under your back, your new spouse beside you, and half the village crowding around the footboard. It's the bedding ceremony, part sacred, part social, part deeply awkward tradition that somehow lasted centuries. See, in medieval Europe, especially in rural parts of England, France, and even Scandinavia, a marriage wasn't considered fully valid until it was consummated. And in case the couple needed a little encouragement or supervision, the community stepped in. Literally. After the wedding feast, you'd be walked, or sometimes carried, to the marriage bed. Guests sang bawdy songs. Priests might offer a blessing. And yes, there were often witnesses, sometimes just a couple of older ladies, sometimes an entire hall of tipsy nobles clapping and hooting. One Scottish custom even involved a guest warming the bed with their own body before the bride arrived. Warm sheets and unwanted sweat. Delightful. Historians still argue whether actual consummation happened in full view. Most agree that the act itself was private, but the lead-up wasn't. You'd undress behind a curtain or beneath a linen sheet held up by relatives. There might be ceremonial kisses, symbolic laying down, and a lot of hopeful nudging. The community wanted proof this marriage was real. You know, just in case someone tried to dispute the inheritance later. And it wasn't just about awkward entertainment. Marriage in medieval society was a legal, economic, and moral contract. Consummation sealed the deal. If you failed to do it or couldn't, it could be grounds for annulment. No pressure, right? But the ceremony also had a strange communal warmth. Neighbors brought gifts. Someone might recite a risque poem. And the newlyweds were often served warm milk, eggs, or even a bit of cake once the deed was presumed done. Like an early version of room service, but with more judgmental stares. Quirky tidbit? In some German territories, the couple's sheets were inspected the next morning for evidence. And if a bride turned up still a virgin weeks later, well, the whole thing might need to be redone with more witnesses. Now picture it. The bride clutching her garland, the groom barely keeping his ale down, and a gaggle of uncles arguing over who gets to pull the curtain closed. The fire crackles, the floor creaks, and somewhere in the rafters, a rat decides now's the time to fall asleep. Romantic. You might ask, did anyone protest this? Occasionally, but more often than not they leaned into it, especially among nobility. In royal courts, bedding ceremonies were political theatre. Kings and queens weren't just marrying each other, they were merging kingdoms. That bed, it was a battlefield of alliances, which makes the idea of a squire holding your underpants feel even more medieval. One famous example: Margaret of Anjou's marriage to Henry VI of England. The couple were escorted to bed by nobles who lifted the bed curtains, offered prayers, and then stood outside, waiting. The next morning, a herald would officially proclaim that the king had performed his marital duties, whether he had or not. But among commoners it could be far less formal, though no less uncomfortable. A Welsh tradition involved throwing barleycorns at the bed to promote fertility. In Ireland, some families placed a symbolic sword between the couple to guard the union. Handy in case things got too exciting. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were, and how often they included real, live audiences. Some suggest they were more common in earlier centuries, fading gradually by the 1600s. Others point out that local customs varied wildly. What was common in a Scottish village might scandalize a Flemish town. But the idea lingered that marriage wasn't just between two people, it was a public event with communal investment. It was witnessed, blessed, sung over, toasted to, and yes, occasionally stared at. And here's a modern twist. Echoes of the bedding ceremony survived well into the 19th century in parts of rural Europe. Even in Victorian England, some villages still held mock ceremonies where friends would pretend to drag the couple to bed, often giggling dressed as devils or angels, like a slightly terrifying bachelor party with more lace. Let's be real, if you had to endure that today, you'd probably run off to Vegas or elope via Zoom. But back then, it was a rite of passage. It marked the end of girlhood, the beginning of womanhood, and, ideally, the continuation of your family's lineage, whether you were ready or not. And maybe, amidst all the noise and pageantry, there was comfort in knowing you weren't alone. Your auntie was there. Your cousin was probably drunk. And tomorrow, everyone would pretend they didn't hear a thing, so you lie back. The straw mattress rustles. Somewhere outside, a goat sneezes, and you think, if this is marriage, what on earth comes next? The goat sneezes again, but by the time you open your eyes, the world has changed once more. The air is drier, brighter, and sharper. Sand crunches faintly underfoot as you walk through a Romanesque cloister garden, greenery carefully pruned, columns carved with saints and grapes, and silence heavy with incense. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls, and right now, you're not here to pray. You're here to calculate because you've fallen in love. But before you even think about getting married in medieval Catholic Europe, you'll need to solve a puzzle. Are you related? And if so, how many cousins removed is too close? You see, for centuries, the Catholic Church had rules about who could marry whom. These weren't just about avoiding direct siblings. No, we're talking deep, chart-drawing, hair-pulling genealogical math. According to canon law, if you and your beloved shared a common ancestor within 7 generations, your marriage was forbidden. No exceptions. That's right. 7th degree of consanguinity. And no, you don't get a calculator. It meant that in small medieval villages where people rarely travelled more than 10 miles from home, most eligible suitors were actually off limits. Not that this stopped folks, but if you were discovered, the marriage could be annulled, fines levied, and your children deemed illegitimate. So how did anyone marry at all? Well, here's the twist. These rules kept changing. By the 13th century, the Church adjusted the forbidden degrees from 7 to 4, which still meant you couldn't legally marry your first cousin, but maybe your second was fair game. Historians still argue whether these shifting laws were about genuine concern for genetic health or just a clever way for the Church to control who got land, money, and social status. After all, they had the power to grant dispensations, for a fee, of course, and yes, the Pope's office was positively flooded with requests. Want to marry your third cousin who happens to own half of Normandy? Better start drafting that letter to Rome. The paperwork was exhaustive. Families kept careful records, creating elaborate family trees that looked like leafless, knotted vines. Noble families in particular had to double and triple check before making matches. In Spain, even the royals got tangled. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand? Yep, second cousins. But they got the necessary papal bull and tied the knot anyway. The Pope was quite accommodating if the match served the Church's interests. A quirky tidbit. In some places, couples who couldn't afford a dispensation faked their genealogy. Entire documents were forged just to push two people's common ancestor far enough back. It became a little like medieval resume padding, but for love. Imagine it now. You're in a candlelit study, scratching away at parchment, trying to remember if your great-great-grandmother's uncle was the brother of your cousin's grandfather's second wife. Get it wrong, and the bishop might annul your wedding after it happened. Oh, and don't forget affinity laws, another delightful layer. These stated that once you married someone, their entire family was off limits for you forever. So, if your spouse died, you couldn't marry their sibling, even if you weren't technically related by blood. But we have such chemistry. Nope. Church says no. You might think the laity revolted. Not exactly. These rules were seen as moral guardrails, and parish priests often reinforced them with sermons. Yet local enforcement varied wildly. In rural parishes, a wink and a donation might make the priest forget your cousin. Count. In cities, however, the church kept tighter reins. Over time, Protestant reforms began peeling these laws back. Martin Luther himself mocked them, calling them unnecessary burdens invented by the papacy. By the 16th century, many Protestant regions started allowing cousin marriages again, though the Catholic Church held firm on its stricter boundaries for much longer. Even today, echoes of these medieval laws linger. Some countries still ban marriages between cousins, others allow them only under strict conditions, and in certain royal families it remained almost a requirement. Looking at you, Habsburgs, you trudge through this bureaucratic labyrinth and start to see it clearly. Marriage, for much of history, wasn't about love. It was about alliances, property, and avoiding sin. And sin was often whatever the current canon lawyers decided it was. Still, there's something oddly tender about it too. In a world where choices were limited, some couples fought tooth and nail through paperwork, bribes, and legal gymnastics just to be together. That has to count for something. So you lean against a cool stone column, squinting at your family tree, your ink-stained fingers trembling just a bit. You trace the line between your name and theirs, and counting, hoping, calculating. 1, 2, 3. And praying the Pope's secretary is in a good mood. You're still counting great-great-grandmothers when the soft crunch of sand gives way to something firmer. Dirt-packed earth beneath your sandals, a crisp breeze tugging at your hair, and the sound of distant grunting from the training yard. You're in Sparta now, ancient Greece's militarized marvel, where emotions are buried under discipline and personal privacy is considered a bit indulgent. And yes, they do marriage differently here too. In fact, your wedding night might just begin with kidnapping, though not in the way you'd expect. You've been training for this, kind of? Spartan girls were raised strong, educated, and encouraged to wrestle and run. Scandalous to other Greek city-states, but perfectly normal here. But despite your strength, you're not quite prepared for tonight's little drama. Just after sunset, your head is shaved. That's right, your long hair, pride of many a Spartan girl, is snipped off and tossed aside like vegetable trimmings. Then you're dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. No frills, no perfume, no fancy veil, just a plain tunic that says, "I am no delicate flower." Historians still argue whether this strange ritual had symbolic meaning, perhaps to mimic masculinity, perhaps to signal humility, or perhaps to blur gender roles for a society that valued uniformity above all. Others suggest it helped ease the groom, who may have been raised in all-male military barracks, into the terrifying novelty of female companionship. You sit quietly in a dark room, no torches, no chatter, maybe a faint smell of olive oil in the air. And then your husband sneaks in. Yes, sneaks. He doesn't walk in with ceremony or pride. He tiptoes like a teenager breaking curfew, because Spartan men didn't live with their wives, not at first. They lived in communal military barracks where camaraderie and war readiness trumped romance. So your new husband shows up in the middle of the night, maybe still smelling faintly of leather armor, maybe carrying a stolen olive or two. You don't speak much. Maybe you whisper, maybe not. And then, just as silently, he leaves before dawn. You'll repeat this odd nightly ritual again and again, brief, private visits hidden from society until eventually, perhaps after the birth of a child, you'll be considered a full wife and welcomed into his home. Quirky, right? But it worked for them. And it wasn't just about keeping the men focused on war. This whole shadowy arrangement reflected a society obsessed with balance between public duty and private life, between strength and reproduction, between loyalty to Sparta and loyalty to your family line. Even weddings themselves were subdued affairs. No feasting, no wild flute music, no parading through town. Spartan culture prized simplicity and restraint. A lavish party was seen as a sign of weakness, or worse, Athenian behavior. Here's your quirky tidbit. Spartan women had more freedom and economic power than almost any other women in ancient Greece. They could own land, inherit property, and even manage estates while their husbands trained for battle. Yet their marriages began with head shaving and midnight visits. Go figure. Now imagine it. You're lying in a darkened room, hair prickling at your scalp, breath shallow as the door creaks open. No fanfare, no poetry, just the weight of someone sitting beside you on the bed, a hushed greeting, a calloused hand brushing your arm, and then silence. And you wonder, is this closeness? Is this what love looks like in a city where vulnerability is dangerous? The irony isn't lost on you. In a society that feared softness, this quiet nightly ritual became one of its few intimate corners. No one saw, no one judged. You and he alone in the dark with your matching cloaks and shorn heads and unspoken hopes. Historians still debate how much affection Spartan couples shared, or whether love even had a place in their worldview. But letters survive, hints of tenderness, stories of Spartan mothers mourning fallen sons, of wives guarding their husbands' names like fire. Clearly, emotion found its way in, even in a world built to shut it out. And then one day, after many nights, many whispers, you are no longer the secret midnight wife. You move in. You hold your husband's spear while he sharpens it. You plant olive trees. You raise children who are told from the cradle to be brave or die trying. So yes, Spartan marriage may have started with a kidnapping, a buzz cut, and the quietest honeymoon in history. But within those limits, something surprisingly human endured. You pull your cloak tighter, your shaved scalp warm beneath the fabric, and listen for the soft tread of sandals outside the door. In Sparta, marriage wasn't a party, it was a duty, but in the dark, with no one watching, maybe it was something else too. When the door creaks shut behind your Spartan husband, the scene begins to shimmer again. Dust becomes cobblestones, silence turns into a babble of market chatter, and you suddenly find yourself standing in the middle of an open-air livestock auction, except something's not quite right, because that's not a cow tied to the rope, that's a woman. And this isn't a sale of animals, it's a wife auction. Welcome to Georgian England, where if your marriage was unbearable but divorce was legally out of reach, you might just lead your spouse to market and sell her to the highest bidder. Yes, seriously, it's the 18th or early 19th century. You're a working-class man in a country that makes divorce nearly impossible for anyone outside the aristocracy. Official separation requires a private act of parliament, expensive, slow, and riddled with scandal. But the public? They've cooked up their own workaround. You trudge into the market square, rope in hand, wife at the other end. The crowd gathers. This is no secret affair. There might be cheering, jeering, and maybe a bit of ale sloshed around. Your wife stands silently, wearing her best apron, or maybe a bonnet if she wants to look particularly appealing, while you announce her availability like she's a slightly temperamental mule. Historians still argue whether these auctions had any real legal standing. Officially, of course, they didn't. But socially? In many communities, once a wife was auctioned and accepted by another man, often someone she already favoured, the whole town simply considered the deal done. The first husband walked away with a few coins and a clean conscience. The new buyer walked away with a companion. And the woman? Well, she walked away with whoever she preferred slightly more. In some accounts, the wife's consent was vital. She might even orchestrate the whole thing herself, nudging her husband toward a divorce by marketplace because she'd already lined up her next partner. Other stories are darker. Resentful wives dragged unwillingly into humiliating public displays. The most famous case? In 1832, a woman named Mary lived in Yorkshire with her husband, who offered her at auction. A man bid a shilling. She nodded, the husband accepted, and Mary was led away, smiling reportedly, by her new partner. Some newspapers even covered these events like they were part of the gossip column. A quirky tidbit, the rope mattered. Most auctions involve tying the wife around the wrist or waist with a halter, like livestock. But the placement varied. Some were led by the neck, some by the arm, others even threw the ring on a nosepiece, purely symbolically. The symbolism was part farce, part formality, and part brutal metaphor. Now imagine the scene: muddy boots, livestock bleating in the background, your fate decided on a wooden stool by two men sipping cider and squinting at you like a prize goose. You wonder what your worth might be: a few shillings, a pint of gin, maybe a new set of boots? And what about the children? Good question. In many cases the kids stayed with the mother, but not always. Sometimes they were divvied up like furniture, and sometimes, if things went especially badly, they were left behind entirely. This practice wasn't confined to some obscure backwater. Records show wife auctions happening all across England, in towns big and small, from Cornwall to Yorkshire. Some local magistrates even turned a blind eye, knowing that for working-class families, this bizarre ritual was the only escape hatch from unhappy unions. Still, not everyone approved. By the mid-19th century, newspapers began condemning the practice more openly. Moralists called it degrading. Legal reformers called it illegal. But rural communities clung to the tradition until divorce laws were finally reformed in the late 1800s. Want to laugh? In one recorded case, a man led his wife to market, offered her for sale, and when no one bid, he shouted, "She's clean, cooks well, and rarely bites." No takers. Eventually, she bid on herself and bought herself. Talk about reclaiming your independence. You stand in that market square now, feeling the rope tug lightly at your waist. You look into the crowd. Maybe you see someone waiting, a face you recognize, someone you trust. Maybe you see no one, just blurred stares and the glint of copper coins. The wind smells of hay and onions. The crier calls for silence. The bids begin. For better or worse, and it was often worse, this strange workaround allowed people to undo legal knots in a world where real divorce was locked behind wealth and rank. It was messy, public, embarrassing, but it was something. And as you walk away unbound and unsanctioned, you wonder, was this freedom or just a different kind of bargain? The muddy streets of the Georgian market dissolve beneath your feet, replaced by the scent of damp stone and blooming wildflowers. The air feels heavier now, quieter, almost reverent. You're standing in front of a modest stone chapel nestled in the French countryside, but something feels off. There's a photograph nailed to the church wall, a black ribbon tied carefully around it. The face in the photo is pale, serene, and unmistakably deceased. Because tonight you're attending a wedding, but the groom, he's no longer among the living. Welcome to the haunting world of posthumous marriage, a legal and symbolic union between a living person and a dead one. And no, this isn't myth. In France, it's very real, and still practiced in rare cases even today. It all started with heartbreak. In December 1959, a dam in Fréjus collapsed, releasing a wall of water that killed over 400 people. Among the victims was a man named André Capra, who had been engaged to a woman named Irène Jodard. Their wedding was days away. Crushed by grief, but desperate to honor their bond, Irène petitioned the French government for permission to marry André after his death. Unbelievably, President Charles de Gaulle approved it. The law that followed, known as le mariage posthume, was born from that tragedy. And so it goes in France: if your fiancé dies unexpectedly, and if there's proof that both parties intended to marry, you can request a posthumous union. The living partner appears in court. The deceased is represented by an empty chair. You walk to the altar alone. The ring is placed on a photograph. You sign the registry. Your status becomes legally married, widowed at once. Historians still debate the cultural meaning of this practice. Is it a compassionate recognition of loss or a romanticized legal ghost story? Some argue it's a psychological balm giving structure and dignity to grief. Others find it unnerving, a kind of bureaucratic séance. It's not common. Every case must be approved by the President of the Republic, but each time it's granted, it brings an eerie grace to the edges of mourning. And it's not just France. In 20th century Germany, Nazi soldiers killed in battle were sometimes married posthumously to their pregnant fiancées. This gave the child legitimacy, inheritance rights, and the mother widow's benefits. Cold policy cloaked in romance. Still, there's something deeply human in it, a desire to make a promise matter, even if death interrupts it. A way to say, we were supposed to have a life together, and that still means something. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some posthumous weddings, a symbolic wedding meal is still served. The photograph of the deceased is seated at the table, perhaps with a small bouquet placed in front of it. Guests raise a glass. Some laugh, some cry. It's a wedding in every sense but one. Now picture it. You sit beside the empty chair. The priest's voice trembles slightly. The chapel is half lit. Mourners and well-wishers wear somber expressions, somewhere between funeral and feast. You're handed a marriage certificate, but there's no honeymoon, no shared keys, no house to return to, and yet there's closure. Legally, you may now collect your spouse's pension. You may take their name. You may, in some small way, finish what was supposed to begin. Of course, not everyone understands. Some find it unsettling, even absurd. Why marry a corpse? They ask. But grief doesn't care about logic. Love often survives the body. And for those left behind, a ritual, no matter how strange, can offer structure to sorrow. Historians still puzzle over how something so surreal became enshrined in law. Perhaps it's because France has long loved romantic tragedy. Think of Victor Hugo, of doomed lovers in poetry and politics. Or perhaps it's simply because sometimes grief needs a shape, and law gives it one. You look again at the photograph on the altar. The face is calm, yours isn't. But the vows echo softly in your ears, carried on the cold chapel breeze. To have and to hold, in life and in death, even if death got here first. You step out of the chapel, the last vow still lingering in your ears like a half-finished song, and the sky above shifts, darker now, starless, dense with the smell of incense and soil. You're no longer in France. You're in a remote Chinese village centuries ago, where the silence is uneasy and the living are not the only ones being wed. Because here, the bride and groom are both dead. And their wedding isn't just accepted, it's necessary. This is the world of ghost marriages, a ritual dating back at least 2,000 years in Chinese history, with traditions that continue to flicker even today in hidden corners. It's a place where the boundary between the living and the dead is porous, and where unmarried souls are said to wander, lonely, restless, incomplete. You crouch beside a simple altar. Incense coils spiral upward. On the ground lie red envelopes, ash, and a pair of paper effigies dressed in wedding garments, one male, one female. The air feels thick. The elders whisper prayers. Why such a ceremony? Because in traditional Chinese belief, to die unmarried is to be cursed with solitude, even in the afterlife. The family line is left unfinished, the ancestral rites grow silent. And so the solution: marry the dead. Sometimes the match is between two deceased people. Their spirits, it's said, can then keep each other company in the afterworld, their tablets placed side by side on the family shrine. But sometimes a living person marries a dead one, usually to fulfill an obligation, a betrothal cut short by tragedy, or in cases where the spirit of the deceased is believed to be causing misfortune until appeased. Historians still argue whether these marriages were primarily spiritual appeasements or tools of social order. Some see them as deeply rooted in ancestor worship. Others suggest they were ways to solidify property claims, inheritance, or even family alliances beyond the grave. But the practice is more than myth. In 2016, Chinese police uncovered a ring that had been robbing female corpses from graves to sell them as ghost brides. Yes, a black market trade in the remains of young women, sold to grieving families of dead bachelors. The prices could reach thousands of dollars. Gruesome? Certainly. But the tradition itself is far older and far more complex. Picture this. Two families meeting, each bringing offerings. A dowry is exchanged, not in silk and gold, but in joss paper and spirit money. A feast is prepared, not for guests, but for ancestors. And the wedding? It's conducted with paper effigies, wooden spirit tablets, and silence, always silence. The bride and groom are represented by red-dressed dolls, sometimes buried together in a shared coffin. The union is considered binding spiritually, ancestrally, and sometimes even legally. The living family is expected to carry out rituals for their new in-law. The dead, it is hoped, find peace. A quirky tidbit? In some regions, a deceased groom might marry a living bride, who then moves in with the groom's family, adopts their surname, wears widow's clothes, and lives as a symbolic daughter-in-law. She is expected to remain loyal to her ghost husband, and yes, this has happened in modern times. There are reports as recently as the 1990s of women entering such marriages in rural provinces. You might think, why would anyone agree to this? But imagine being a poor village girl with no dowry, no prospects, and no protection. Marrying into a wealthy family, even as a ghost bride, might grant you security, food, and a roof over your head. In a strange twist, marrying the dead could offer more than marrying the living. Historians still debate how widespread the practice truly was versus how much of it lingers in myth. But the stories remain. They show up in Qing dynasty records, in temple inscriptions, and in whispered family tales. And in some rural places, even now, families still seek spirit matches for their unmarried dead. You look again at the effigies. The paper groom tilts slightly, caught in a breeze. The bride's red sash glows faintly in the firelight. There is no music, no laughter. Only the rustle of paper, the murmured prayers, and the quiet hope that two souls, once alone, might now walk together into the mist. It's a marriage made not in heaven, but in memory. A promise that even in death you won't be forgotten. The scent of burned joss paper still clings to your sleeves when the wind shifts again, this time carrying the tang of old ale, chimney soot, and damp wool. You're back in England now, but the year is 1820-something, and you're walking into a public house. There's laughter, clinking mugs, and a strange sense of finality in the air, because tonight you're getting divorced. No court, no judge, no scandalous headlines, just a wedge of cheese, a table in the corner, and your soon-to-be ex-husband sitting across from you with a resigned look on his face. This is a divorce by meal, a ritual, half symbolic and half serious, that played out in England's lower classes for generations. And while not technically legal, it held surprising weight in the eyes of community and conscience. Here's how it worked. You and your estranged spouse agree to meet at a local inn. The publican is warned he'll need extra bread. You take a seat together, order a shared meal, often including hard cheese and ale, and eat it in complete silence. No conversation, no negotiation, just chewing. Once the meal is done, you both stand. Each places a coin on the table, solemnly. One turns and walks out. The other waits a moment, then follows, each going a different direction. Divorce accomplished. Of course, this wasn't law. England's actual divorce system was labyrinthine, expensive, and reserved for the wealthy. To officially separate, a couple needed to secure a private Act of Parliament. Few could afford that. So working-class couples created rituals that mimicked legal finality, even if no one in London's courtrooms ever noticed. Historians still argue whether these meal divorces were genuine attempts at resolution or just performative farewells layered with folklore. Either way, they reflected a deep human need for closure, especially in a time when marriage was a nearly unbreakable chain. And it wasn't always somber. In some villages, friends gathered to bear witness, like a reverse wedding. A crowd might raise a glass, toast your mutual survival, and let out a cheer when the exes exited in opposite directions. One contemporary account even described a woman shouting, "Good riddance to bad boots," as she slammed the door. Your quirky tidbit for this section? In certain areas, it was considered bad form to look over your shoulder after leaving. Doing so might undo the separation like a very low-budget magical curse. So you walked away, forward, silent, and without regret. Imagine the scene now. The pub is dimly lit, the fire crackling, a plate of bread and cheese resting between you. You chew slowly. It squeaks faintly between your teeth. Your spouse doesn't look up. The barmaid pretends not to watch, but you see her eyes flicker. She knows what this is. You finish your ale. The mug thuds. You both stand. There's no fanfare, no signature, just the weight of knowing you tried and that tonight you let go. It's easy to laugh at now. Divorce by cheese. Really? But remember, when legal systems fail ordinary people, they invent their own rituals. From auctioning wives to silently splitting loaves, these traditions allowed communities to enforce their own sense of fairness, however fragile. Historians still debate how widespread the practice was. Some say it was limited to a few northern counties. Others claim it happened across England and parts of Ireland. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, enough to be remembered, not enough to be officially respected. And here's the most human part. Sometimes these separations weren't permanent. A few couples remarried each other after time apart. Others reconciled unofficially, slipping back into shared routines without ceremony. But for those who didn't, this meal marked a clear, dividing line. Before and after. You wipe your fingers on your apron. The bread is gone, the cheese cold. You leave your coin. And as you step outside, the air feels fresher than it has in months. You don't look back, because the marriage may be over, but the story keeps going. The tavern door swings shut behind you and the world changes yet again. This time, the scent in the air is oddly clean. Antiseptic, almost. The sky above is pale, the roads freshly paved, and the people around you are holding smartphones. Because now, you're not just in the present day, you're in Iceland. And tonight, you're not wondering whether you can get married. You're wondering whether you should, because before you kiss that charming stranger at the bar, you pause, not for breath, not for nerves, but to check your phone. You open the Islendinga app, yes, a real app, designed for one very modern, very awkward reason. In Iceland, there's a non-zero chance that the person you just flirted with is your cousin. Let's rewind a little. Iceland has a tiny population, around 380,000 people, most of whom are descended from the same small group of Norse settlers who arrived over 1,000 years ago. That's not a lot of genetic wiggle room. In fact, if you're Icelandic, odds are pretty good that you share at least some blood with almost everyone on the island. So how do you avoid accidental incest in the age of dating apps and dimly lit clubs? Simple. You use a genealogy app that lets you bump phones and find out if you're related. No sparks. Proceed. Shared great-grandparent. Abort mission. This may sound like the ultimate buzzkill, but in Iceland, it's become a quirky, practical part of modern courtship. The app, developed by a group of university students using public genealogical databases, cross-references your ancestry with your potential partners in real time. And while it started partly as a joke, it caught on fast, especially among younger people in urban areas. Historians still argue whether Iceland's strict attention to genealogy is a modern invention or a natural continuation of its cultural roots. This is, after all, a country that's been meticulously tracking family lines since the Islendingabok, a genealogical book dating back to the 12th century. They've always cared who begat whom, but the fact that it's now digitized, searchable, and casually accessible at parties, that's new. Your quirky tidbit? The app comes with a feature called Incest Alert. If you're within a few degrees of relation, it plays an audible warning sound, sometimes jokingly referred to as the kissing alarm. It's like Tinder meets Ancestry.com meets a mildly judgmental horn. Imagine it now. You're in a cozy Reykjavik bar, snow tapping softly at the windows. You lean in. He's handsome, smells faintly of pine soap and wool. You smile, flirt, maybe laugh a little too loudly, and then, like pulling a parking brake, you both reach for your phones. A few taps, a shared glance. The app loads. No match. You exhale. The kiss continues. But if there is a match, well, you shake hands politely, back away, and maybe order another Brennivine to drown the disappointment. Love in the time of shared great-uncles. This isn't just about avoiding awkward family reunions. Icelanders, for all their modernity, remain deeply connected to their heritage. The past is close here. Genealogy is discussed casually, even proudly. Children memorize their lineages the way others memorize multiplication tables. Knowing where you come from is part of knowing who you are. Historians still debate whether Iceland's approach to marriage is unique or a preview of what's to come elsewhere. As genetic testing becomes cheaper and more common, other small or isolated populations may adopt similar tools. After all, love is complicated enough without adding surprise, second cousins into the mix. And yet, for all its logic, there's something undeniably funny about it too. Romance has always had obstacles, warring families, clashing classes, disapproving elders. But in Iceland, it's your family tree app that might stand in your way. You finish your drink, the snow outside thickens, the bar grows warmer, softer, fuzzier around the edges, and somewhere nearby a couple leans in, phone screens glowing between them, waiting to see if fate or a distant aunt gets the final word. The snow fades. The soft hum of Reykjavik nightlife dissolves into a whistling wind that bites at your cheeks. Now you're high, far above sea level, where the air is thin, the earth rocky, and the roofs are flat and low against the slope of the mountain. Welcome to the Himalayas, to stone villages perched on ridges where clouds drift between doorways and where marriage follows rules written not in books, but in terrain. Here, the marriage isn't between two people. It's between a woman and all the brothers of a single family. You've stepped into a world of fraternal polyandry, a rare but deeply practical marriage system found in parts of Tibet, Nepal, and northern India. In this system, one woman marries multiple brothers, not cousins, not neighbors, brothers, and everyone agrees to share everything, including her. Now, before your eyebrows fly off your forehead, consider this. You're a farming family in the Himalayas. Arable land is scarce, inheritance is complicated, and splitting a farm into smaller and smaller plots across generations would doom you to poverty. So what's the solution? Keep the family land intact by keeping the brothers married to one wife. You're that wife. You marry the eldest brother, but it's understood his younger siblings are part of the package. You live in a single house. You share meals. You share chores. And yes, you share a marriage bed, though not always at the same time. Historians still argue whether this system developed purely out of economic necessity or whether it also reflected unique cultural beliefs about family harmony. Perhaps both, but either way it worked. Families with this structure were often more stable, better able to weather famine, and less likely to feud over land. A quirky tidbit? In some villages, the wife assigns each brother a specific night of the week. It's not written down, it's just understood, and everyone follows it. No jealousy, no drama, just a quietly functioning schedule that keeps the peace. Now imagine the household, 5 brothers, all farmers, all a bit weather-worn. You know which one sings in the morning, which one chops firewood best, which one brings you wildflowers without saying a word. You're not a prize to be fought over, you're the glue that holds them together. Of course, it's not always smooth. Some outsiders have criticized the practice, calling it unnatural or patriarchal. But the women who live it don't always agree. Many report feeling respected, valued, and secure, far more than they might in monogamous marriages where they're one wife of a domineering husband. And it's not just women who benefit. Brothers in these unions tend to cooperate more, divide labor more effectively, and make decisions as a collective. It's less every man for himself and more we're in this together. But the system isn't immune to change. In recent decades, as roads and schools and modern media reach these mountain communities, fraternal polyandry has slowly declined. Younger generations, influenced by cities and television, sometimes opt for monogamy. And as tourism grows, some families keep their traditions quieter, wary of judgmental outsiders with selfie sticks. Still, the practice endures quietly, proudly, often out of sight but never out of rhythm. You sit by the hearth now, the wind rattles the shutters, a bowl of barley soup warms your lap. One brother sharpens tools by the door, another mends a goat harness, the others are out in the fields, and you hold the household together. You're not property, you're the centre. Historians still debate the emotional dynamics of these marriages, how affection is managed, how parenting works, how love adapts. But for the families who live it, those questions don't need academic answers. They're lived day by day, meal by meal, snowfall by snowfall. And in a place where survival depends on unity, maybe that's what marriage has always been about. Not passion, not poetry, but partnership. Even if that partnership involves 5 pairs of boots at the door. You leave the Himalayan ridge behind, but not the questions. You descend into warmer air where the trees grow tall and the wine flows more freely. There's laughter again, a flicker of torchlight, and voices echoing through tiled courtyards. You're in ancient Rome once more. But this time, not as a bride. You're a daughter. And you're not the one giving permission to marry. Because in this society, that power belongs not to you, but to the pater familias, the oldest living male of your household. Marriage in Rome was never just a union between 2 people. It was a transaction between families, and one man, your father, grandfather, or even great-grandfather, held the final say. You might be 15, cloaked in orange, clutching a pomegranate and glancing hopefully at your soon-to-be husband, but none of that matters. The decision was made before the veil was chosen, and in some cases so was the groom, when you were still a child. The Roman paterfamilias had near absolute control over the lives of his household members. He could arrange marriages, dissolve them, reclaim dowries, even demand his daughter return home if he deemed the union unworthy. His word was law, at least until he died. Historians still argue whether this authority was more ceremonial than actual by the late Republic, as some women gained social influence through money or marriage. But for many, especially in traditional households, the father's grip remained firm. And if he wasn't around, then the nearest male relative stepped in. Uncle, cousin, brother-in-law, it didn't matter. As a Roman woman, you rarely had full legal autonomy. Your consent was a nice bonus, but not strictly required. Even the act of manus, when legal authority over a bride passed from father to husband, was part of this chain of control. In some cases, women remained under their father's legal domain even after marriage. Imagine that. Married to one man, but still, technically, under your dad's authority. The ancient world's version of living at home and paying rent to 2 people. Here's your quirky tidbit. Roman weddings weren't always gloomy handoffs. Sometimes brides-to-be staged a small rebellion by pretending to resist. One tradition had them dragged, playfully, by their new husbands across the threshold, symbolizing a reluctant departure from childhood. It was theatrical, a little ridiculous, and surprisingly relatable. And what about love? Love. If it happened, it was a side effect, not a requirement. Marriage served political strategy, economic security, and social climbing. Your father might marry you off to an aging senator to curry favor, or a rising military star to secure protection. Your feelings? Adorable, irrelevant. But that doesn't mean all Roman women were pawns. Some, especially in the imperial period, used their roles shrewdly. Wealthy matriarchs like Livia Drusilla wielded enormous influence behind the scenes, arranging marriages, managing estates, and pulling strings no matter which man held the title pater familias. Still, the reality for most was quieter, less power, more patience. You stood in the atrium as scrolls were exchanged and dowries calculated. You smiled when expected. You wore the red veil. You lit the ceremonial fire. You didn't ask why. Historians still debate how often daughters were truly consulted. Letters from Roman women suggest a spectrum, from arranged marriages to genuine affection. But what's clear is this. In Roman society, marriage was never your decision alone. It was a contract, witnessed by 10 men, overseen by gods, and approved, always, by a man in a chair with a family ring on his finger. You sit now in that atrium. Your hair is coiled. Your tunic stiff with new linen. You can hear the low murmur of your father's voice through the curtain, finalizing your fate over a goblet of watered wine. And you wonder, will this man I've never met be kind? Will he listen when I speak? Or will I spend the rest of my life kneeling at one hearth, dreaming of another? The murmurs from behind the curtain fade. The polished stone under your sandals softens into dewy grass. A mist creeps across the moorland, and suddenly you're no longer in Rome. You're somewhere older, wilder, where druids still mutter to oak trees and the wind carries more than weather. You're in Celtic territory now, perhaps in early medieval Ireland or Scotland, in a culture that understands that life is uncertain and so are marriages. That's why here, instead of a binding contract or legal performance, you might begin your union with a trial marriage, a practice called a hand fasting. 1 year, 1 day, that's all. The two of you agree to live together, share a bed, tend the hearth, and see what unfolds. No priests, no lawyers, no dowry-choked paperwork, just two hands tied together, literally with a strip of cloth and a shared understanding. Let's try this, and if it works, we stay. It sounds romantic now, but in reality it was both pragmatic and deeply cultural. In scattered communities where survival depended on cooperation more than sentiment, testing a partnership made sense. Could you work together, handle the lambing season, share salted fish and silence through winter? Historians still argue whether this was a widespread legal practice or more of a symbolic folk tradition. Some scholars believe it offered communities a flexible model of pairing, particularly before church doctrines tightened their grip. Others suggest it was more of a rural compromise, a soft launch before the hard contract. But it did exist. It's mentioned in Brehon law, texts from Ireland which allowed marriages of various types, fixed term, full property sharing, partial alliances. In other words, medieval Celtic societies offered something rare for their time, options. And here's your quirky tidbit. After the year and a day, the couple could either agree to remain together permanently or walk away, no harm, no scandal, no scarlet letters. If there were children, arrangements would be made. If there were sheep, someone took the better ones. It was civilized, it was calm, it was, dare we say, adult. You sit now on a low wooden stool inside a thatched round house. The walls are dark, the fire small. Your partner is mending a fishing net. You're grinding oats. It's been 6 months. So far, so good. There have been no major storms, no serious fights. You even made it through that endless lentil week without yelling. But in the back of your mind, the clock ticks. The year and a day will come. You wonder, will we say yes? Or nod politely and part ways like travellers at a crossroads? What's most remarkable is the lack of shame. In this society, ending a trial marriage doesn't make you a failure. It makes you honest. You tried. You learned. Maybe you'll marry someone else next year. Maybe you won't. The land doesn't care. The cows certainly don't. Over time, of course, Christianity chipped away at these customs. By the high Middle Ages, church weddings became the norm, and hand fastings were pushed to the margins. But even then, echoes remained. In some Scottish villages, couples still tied hands over a stone altar as late as the 17th century. In rural festivals, young people still sang songs of temporary unions and summer flings, sealed with whispered oaths. Historians still debate whether modern hand-fasting ceremonies are accurate revivals or romantic reinterpretations, but the heart of the idea endures, that marriage, at least once, was a choice you could try on first, like a warm cloak before the long winter. You rise from your stool. The fire crackles. Your partner looks up and smiles, not a grand cinematic grin, but a quiet, familiar one. The kind you've come to appreciate more than flowers or feasts. Maybe it's working, maybe it won't. But for tonight, you pour the broth, share the bread, and sit side by side on a bench made for two. And that's enough. The Celtic hearth fades, and with it the smell of oatcakes and wet moss. In its place rises incense, thick, sweet, unfamiliar. The floor beneath you is polished stone, cool and smooth, and outside you hear bells, deep, resonant, echoing through the banyan trees. You're in India now, and you're about to get married to a tree, not because you love botany or because your florist cousin dared you, but because your horoscope, yes, your birth chart, has declared you dangerously inauspicious. You're Manglik, and that means you bring misfortune, particularly to your future husband. But don't worry, there's a loophole. Before marrying a man, you must first marry a sacred tree, most often a banyan, a banana plant, or even a peepal tree. The ritual is elaborate, traditional, and taken very seriously by those who practice it. You'll wear a red sari, you'll circle the tree with garlands, the priest will chant, guests may attend, rice may be thrown, and at the end of the ceremony you will be, quite literally, a tree's wife. The purpose? To neutralize the astrological imbalance. Your first husband, the tree, absorbs the bad luck like a green leafy sponge. And then, with that danger discharged, you're free to marry a human man without fear of cursing his future, his fortune, or, worst of all, his mother's opinion of you. Historians still argue whether this practice emerged from ancient Vedic principles or later cultural layers of fear and protectionism. The broader belief is rooted in Jyotish, the Hindu system of astrology that considers the positions of planets like Mars, Mangal, at the time of birth. If Mars is in certain houses, it's believed to bring fiery conflict, especially in marriage. But if you marry a tree first, Mars is pacified, the stars realign, everyone breathes easier. Here's your quirky tidbit. Sometimes, if a suitable tree isn't available, a silver or gold idol is used. In other cases, a clay pot is married and then smashed, symbolizing the end of the first marriage. The symbolism is complex but consistent. You were dangerous, now you're not. Now picture it. You stand barefoot in the dust, your anklets chiming with each step as you circle the banyan. The priest sprinkles water, your parents whisper blessings, the leaves rustle faintly, no judgment, just the wind. After the ceremony, you feed the tree, you light a diya, you bow. And sometimes, depending on local custom, the tree is cut down, its duty fulfilled, its bark, metaphorically speaking, tougher than most men. Critics of the practice, both within and outside India, have called it regressive, superstitious, or demeaning. But those who uphold it argue the opposite, that it offers a remedy, a second chance, a bridge between belief and love. And many Manglik women go on to live perfectly ordinary, happy marriages, sometimes with partners who don't believe in astrology at all. Still, the ritual remains. It offers peace of mind, not just for brides, but for families. It turns fear into action, and action into ritual. Historians still debate how often these marriages actually occur in modern times. Some say they're dwindling, others say they're merely quieter now, folded into temple ceremonies, performed without Instagram posts. But one thing is certain, for those who believe, the stars matter, and sometimes so does the bark. You take one last look at the banyan. Its branches spread wide, ancient and calm. It does not speak, it does not blink, it does not mind being married to you for 20 minutes. And as you step away, free, blessed, cleared, you adjust your sari, hold your head high and prepare for a marriage where the groom is slightly less photosynthetic. You leave the banyan tree behind, its garlands swaying gently in the wind. Now the scent in the air shifts again, less incense, more iodine. You're somewhere in 20th century America, just as the automobile hum begins to drown out the horse cart, and your engagement ring sparkles with hope, and a looming appointment at the local health department, because before you get that marriage license, the state needs something from you, blood. You're entering the strange chapter of history where getting married meant getting tested for syphilis. Beginning in the 1930s and spreading widely through the 1940s and beyond, many US states enacted laws requiring couples to undergo blood tests before they could legally wed. These weren't compatibility tests or some romantic medical bonding experience. They were a public health measure born out of anxiety, science, and more than a little moral panic. And if your test came back positive, you couldn't marry, at least not right away. Historians still argue whether these laws were truly effective disease control measures or whether they were more about social control, making sure undesirables didn't reproduce. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere awkwardly in between. Syphilis had been a public health nightmare since the late 19th century. By the early 20th, it was widespread, feared, and poorly understood. The development of the Wassermann test, a method for detecting syphilis in blood, led to a wave of optimism. If we test everyone, thought lawmakers, we can stop it in its tracks. Enter premarital blood tests. You and your betrothed would show up to a clinic, roll up your sleeves, and have blood drawn. The results had to be submitted before your marriage license would be issued. Sometimes the tests also screened for rubella or tuberculosis. But syphilis was the real fear. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some states, public service announcements about premarital blood testing were illustrated with cartoons of unhappy brides left weeping at the altar because their fiancé's blood work flunked. Don't be caught off guard, the posters warned. Test before you tie the knot. You sit now in a linoleum-tiled hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. You smell antiseptic and old paper. Your fiancé is tapping his foot, his tie too tight. You're holding hands, but your palms are clammy. It's not just the wedding jitters. It's the knowledge that your love is now subject to lab work. And if one of you does test positive, the fallout varies. In some cases, treatment was required before a license could be issued. In others, the couple was simply denied the right to marry, though many still found ways around the system, from travelling to states without such laws to marrying unofficially. The requirement wasn't just an American quirk. Several other countries experimented with similar policies during the 20th century, especially during wartime or under authoritarian regimes. But the United States held on to it longer than most. Some states didn't repeal their mandatory blood test laws until the 1980s or even early 90s. Historians still debate whether the decline of these laws was due to improved treatment for syphilis, better sex education, or simply a growing distaste for state interference in private relationships. Probably all three. By the 21st century, most Americans had never heard of the requirement. The idea that you'd have to prove your medical purity to marry seems archaic now, somewhere between laughable and chilling, but for decades it was just another step in the wedding checklist. Dress, check. Venue, check. STD test, check. And like many forgotten rituals of bureaucracy, it left its imprint, quietly shaping the way marriage was viewed, not just as romance, but as a contract with public implications. You sigh, stretch your arm out for the needle, and smile weakly at your partner. You're marrying each other, yes, but first you're marrying public health policy. The nurse swabs your arm, the blood is drawn, and in the end, whether the test was justified or not, it added one more layer to the long, strange history of who gets to marry and on what terms. You tuck away your blood test certificate, the ink still damp, and the buzz of fluorescent lights begins to fade. The hallway melts into heavy stone, stained glass, and the distant toll of bells. You're back in medieval Europe, but this time not as a bride or groom, but as a bishop's customer. Because if you want to get married in the Middle Ages, you'll need more than just a blessing. You'll need to pay the church. And if you skip that, well, you might find yourself fined, shamed, or denied altogether. Welcome to the world of bride fines and ecclesiastical fees, where marriage was not only a sacred union, it was also a tidy business for the local clergy. Marriage, in theory, could happen anywhere. You could make your vows in a field, on a doorstep, even in the middle of a sheep pen, as long as they were mutual and public. But if you wanted the ceremony sanctioned, recorded, and legally binding in the eyes of the church, you needed the help and the signature of your local bishop. And bishops, they didn't work for free. Before your wedding, you'd pay a fee for the banns, the public announcement of your intent to marry, usually read aloud for 3 consecutive Sundays. This gave the community time to raise objections, like, say, if you were already married to someone else. But it also gave the church time to collect a bit of silver. Then came the wedding itself, another fee. Some churches offered different packages: a simple ceremony, 1 coin. Want the wedding inside the church, with candles and choirs? That's extra. A splash of holy water and an official document with your names in real ink? That'll cost you. Historians still argue whether these payments were seen as spiritual offerings or institutional extortion. Some clergy claimed the money covered administrative labour and church upkeep. Others clearly used it to line their pockets and wine cellars. And if you didn't pay, your marriage might be valid but not recognized. You could be forced to do public penance, pay a larger fine later, or worse, have your children declared illegitimate. Legally, socially, and spiritually, this was a dangerous position to be in. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some dioceses, the bishop also received a fee if a widow remarried. This was called a merchet, and it was essentially a tax on second chances. Even in death, your former husband's ghost had to nod in approval and hand over a coin. Now imagine it. You stand at the church door, your cloak pulled tight, your betrothed fidgeting beside you. The priest waits, hand outstretched. You offer your payment, 3 pennies and a small lump of beeswax. He frowns. It's not enough. You add a bit of honeycomb and a promise to donate wool in spring. He sighs, nods, and leads you in. The ceremony is short, no music, a few murmured Latin phrases, a quick joining of hands, a stern look, and then done. You're married. You step outside to a drizzle and a waiting crowd of neighbours who immediately begin judging your choices. And the bishop? He's inside, pocketing the beeswax. Over time, reformers tried to clean up the system. The Protestant Reformation, in particular, railed against pay-to-pray practices, including the monetization of marriage. But even in post-Reformation communities, fees persisted. They were renamed, restructured, rebranded, but always collected. Some priests even grew rich this way, especially in busy parishes. A popular cleric might preside over dozens of weddings each season, each bringing a tidy fee. And if the bride or groom was from a prominent family, expect a bonus, a banquet, or a very nice goose. Historians still debate how common it was for poor couples to be turned away. In some places, clergy made exceptions. In others, they didn't. The church offered a path to holiness, but like any path, it often had toll booths. You walk now through the village square, hand in hand with your new spouse. The ring feels strange on your finger, the blessing rings faintly in your ears, and you glance over your shoulder at the steeple, wondering if the bishop will remember your name, or just the weight of your purse, because in medieval Europe, love was one thing. Marriage, that was a receipt. You walk past the steeple and into the shadows beyond, where the stone paths give way to grasslands stretching across Central Asia. The wind is stronger here, colder, wilder, and the horizon never seems to stop moving. In the distance, horses whinny, and you sense something else too, tension, because in this place, on this vast steppe, love isn't whispered, it's taken. You've stepped into the complicated, controversial, and still very real world of bride capture marriage. The idea is as old as horses. A man wants a wife. He rides to her village. He, or sometimes a group of his friends, takes her by force, by surprise, by plan. And once she is in his home, tradition says she is his wife. And no, this isn't just some mythic echo from a barbarian past. It was real. And in some places it still is. In parts of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and historically across Mongolian and Turkic cultures, this form of marriage, often called alakachu in Kyrgyz, has deep roots. It's hard to say where consent ends and custom begins, because for centuries the act was folded into social norms. Historians still argue whether bride capture was originally symbolic, more like an elopement with dramatic flair, or whether it was always coercive. The answer, as you might expect, varies wildly depending on the region, the era, and the particular marriage in question. In its more consensual versions, the woman expected to be kidnapped. The couple may have planned it. The capture was a dramatized rebellion against parental disapproval or dowry disputes. Everyone knew the script, everyone went along, but in other cases it was exactly what it sounds like, a literal abduction. A young woman riding home from market might be ambushed by a group of men, thrown into a car, or, once upon a time, onto a horse, and taken to the home of a stranger. There the bride's head would be covered in a white scarf, and the family would pressure her to agree to stay. You're sitting now in that dim yurt, surrounded by strangers, the scent of mutton broth heavy in the air. A woman, A grandmother, perhaps, presses your hands, tells you that resisting is shameful, that this is your destiny, that if you go home, your reputation will be ruined anyway. And you realize the ceremony isn't about joy, it's about surrender. A quirky tidbit. Some traditions allowed for fake rescues. A girl who truly didn't want the marriage could be found by her relatives and taken home if they moved quickly. In some villages, the community understood this and would stand aside, but in others, the girl's departure brought dishonor. She might be shunned, even by her own family. And even more bewildering, some women stayed, even those captured against their will. Why? Because going back meant being labeled spoiled, because families couldn't afford to return a dowry, because the choice was never really hers in the first place. Historians still debate how modern societies should view these customs. Are they heritage? Are they violence? Are they both? Today, bride kidnapping is illegal in Kyrgyzstan, and yet it continues, often in rural areas, quietly, justifying itself through the veil of tradition. Some say it's declining, others say it's simply gone underground. Activists have fought hard to expose the harm it causes: early pregnancies, psychological trauma, even suicide. One famous case, Izada Kanatbekova, made headlines in 2021 when she was abducted and later found murdered. Her death sparked protests across Kyrgyzstan and renewed calls for reform. And yet, for every outcry, there's a grandfather saying, "This is how I married your grandmother." There's a cousin laughing, "It's just part of being a man." And somewhere in between, a woman wondering whether her wedding is a celebration or a scar. You stand now at the yurt's threshold. The scarf in your lap is soft. The tea is untouched. The man who brought you here hasn't spoken, but his mother has, and so has his aunt, and all their words carry the same weight. Say yes, or regret everything. You close your eyes. Somewhere outside, a horse snorts and stamps. The wind whips harder now, and you wonder how much of this was tradition, and how much of it was theft, dressed up as ceremony. You step away from the yurt, the wind still tugging at your sleeves, but now the breeze softens, warmer, scented with olive oil and citrus wood. You find yourself standing in an arched stone courtyard in Renaissance Italy, sunlight pouring through open shutters and glinting off polished wood. Before you, carved with curling vines and painted with gold leaf, is a chest. It's not a wedding gift, it's the wedding. This is a cassone, a marriage chest. And here in Florence or Venice or maybe Siena, it is the centerpiece of your union, as important as the bride herself. Because this isn't just furniture, this is your dowry. And in 15th century Italy, a woman without a dowry was a woman without a future. Marriage in this world isn't built on romantic ballads or moonlit walks. It's built on florins, bolts of silk, and how many linen napkins your mother can pack into a box. You're a daughter of a merchant, maybe even minor nobility. Your father has spent months, years, negotiating with another family, not just the size of the dowry, but the contents. Will you bring land, gold, silver hairpins? How many bed sheets? How many chickens? Everything has a price, and every price tells a story. Historians still argue whether the cassone was a tool of female empowerment, giving a woman a share of wealth, or a cage of expectation, binding her value to the objects she carried, perhaps both. But there's no denying it played a starring role. Your dowry determines who you can marry, where you will live, how you will be treated. A larger dowry can elevate your family's status or bankrupt it. Fathers have been known to gamble daughters' dowries in trade deals. Mothers sigh over embroidered linens as if they were letters of recommendation. And the cassone itself, it is a masterpiece. Artisans crafted these chests with mythological scenes, allegories of virtue, sometimes even wedding portraits, painted in tempera, gilded with gold, lined in velvet. Not because anyone will sit and admire them for hours, but because they represent something more than storage. They represent reputation. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some cassone featured paintings of biblical heroines, Esther, Judith, even Susanna, quietly reminding the bride of obedience, cleverness, and appropriate modesty. A little marital motivation built into your sock drawer. Now picture it. Your wedding procession winds through the streets. Musicians play lutes. Neighbours throw rose petals. And behind the carriage carrying you, a mule-drawn cart carries the caisson, decorated, ribboned, flanked by servants. The entire city watches as your dowry rolls by like a parade float of silk and silver. Later, after the feast and the formalities, the chest will be placed in your new home, usually at the foot of your marital bed. It will be yours, sort of. In many Italian city-states, dowries remained legally under the wife's control, but accessing them wasn't always easy, especially if your husband disagreed. And if the marriage ends, if you're widowed, abandoned, or worse, then the caisson might be returned, sometimes empty, sometimes not. A silent messenger from a union undone. Historians still debate the long-term impact of the dowry system in Italy. It created strange dynamics. Rich dowries meant delayed marriages, fewer children, tighter family control. It could empower women economically, but also reduce them to lines in a ledger. Over time, the caisson gave way to simpler trousseaux, and dowry inflation reached absurd levels. Some cities, trying to rein in the madness, passed laws capping dowry sizes. Too little love, too much fabric. But the image lingers, a woman, newly married, standing beside a chest larger than she is. Her name carved into it, her future folded within it, everything she's allowed to bring with her, from pillowcases to personal agency. You rest your hand now on the lid. The wood is smooth, the painted surface glows in the low light. Inside are gowns you didn't choose, coins you've never touched, and promises you didn't make, but must now uphold. And somewhere outside, your husband's relatives are counting napkins. You close the caisson gently, its heavy lid sighing shut, and the gilded chamber around you fades. The embroidered tapestries give way to bare wooden floors and whitewashed walls. You're in 17th century New England now, where the Puritans have built a new world, and with it, a new kind of marriage. A marriage with no music, no dancing, and absolutely no rings. Here, in colonial Massachusetts or Connecticut, Puritan weddings are stripped of all extravagance, because anything that smells too much like a Catholic ceremony, or worse, a frivolous European pageant, is considered unholy. You sit on a stiff-backed bench in a meeting house. There's no stained glass, no incense, no priest in velvet robes. Just the local magistrate, a man in simple black holding a Bible but performing a civil service. Yes, civil. Because in Puritan society, marriage isn't a sacrament, it's a contract, and the church stays politely uninvolved. The logic is theological. Sacraments are sacred, like baptism and communion. Marriage, that's a worldly matter, important but not divine. So instead of being married by a minister, you're joined by a judge, and instead of pledging yourself in flowery verse, you declare your mutual responsibilities. Work hard, raise children, honor God, avoid sin. You won't be exchanging rings either. The Puritans saw wedding bands as papist ornamentation, fancy, worldly, and unnecessary. Jewelry was considered vanity, especially for women. You wouldn't want to suggest that marriage was about beauty or romance, after all. Historians still argue whether this austere model helped or hindered love in early America. Some say it emphasized mutual duty and equality, particularly in work and religious devotion. Others see it as joyless, cold, and punishing. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the starched collar middle. Here's your quirky tidbit. Because of their emphasis on modesty, Puritan wedding attire was often indistinguishable from everyday clothes. No white gowns, no veils, no lace. A bride might wear her best woolen dress, freshly scrubbed, maybe with a ribbon if she was feeling bold. The only way you'd know someone just got married, they looked slightly more nervous than usual. Now picture it. The ceremony is over in 10 minutes. You and your spouse step outside into crisp morning air. No one throws rice. No one plays a fiddle. Your friends nod approvingly. That's it. Then you go home and get to work. Because marriage here isn't an escape or an occasion, it's an assignment, a solemn duty to build a Christian household, raise pious children and avoid the temptations of Satan, which include, among other things, too much laughter, too many pastries, and any form of dancing that involves the hips. Even honeymooning is discouraged. Some couples went straight from the altar to the fields. One famous preacher insisted that couples shouldn't show fondness in public, not even on their wedding day, lest they inflame their own hearts and the hearts of others. Still, there was tenderness in Puritan marriages, though it was often hidden beneath discipline and theology. Letters between husbands and wives reveal affection, mutual respect, even quiet longing during absences. They didn't always say, "I love you," but they might write, "You are ever in my prayers," which, in Puritan speak, was practically a sonnet. And unlike many European societies, Puritan women had significant roles in the household. They managed farms, educated children, contributed to religious life. Marriage was a partnership, albeit one with clearly defined roles and a firm patriarchal structure. Historians still debate how often Puritan marriages were happy, but it's worth noting that divorce, while rare, was possible. If a spouse was abusive, neglectful, or absent, the community might intervene. In some cases, women won those divorces. You walk now through the village green, your new spouse beside you. The sky is grey, the air smells of wood smoke and damp wool. There's no feast, no song, no thrown bouquet, but you have a cow to milk, a roof to patch, psalms to memorize. And maybe, just maybe, when the shutters are drawn and the candles are blown out, you'll whisper something soft into the dark and hear something even softer in return. No rings, no frills, just you, your spouse, and a shared resolve to keep the devil out of the kitchen. The candle flickers out, the wooden walls dissolve, and you find yourself back in the present, but not in a quiet house, and not on a windswept hill. You're in an office. There's fluorescent lighting, a break room with instant coffee, and a laminated HR policy taped to the wall. Welcome to modern Japan, where marriage isn't just a personal decision, it's something you might have to report to your employer. Because here, love doesn't always begin with flowers. Sometimes it starts with paperwork. In many Japanese companies, when two co-workers begin a romantic relationship, or especially when they decide to marry, it's not uncommon for them to submit a love contract to their company's HR department, a formal signed acknowledgement of their relationship. It might sound strange, it might even sound invasive, but in Japan's deeply structured work culture, where harmony, WA, is prized above individual expression, personal relationships can be seen as a potential source of tension or gossip. The logic is clear. If two employees are dating and it affects team dynamics, the company wants to know. And if they're getting married, the office may be expected to throw a small party, offer a gift, or reassign one partner to avoid conflicts of interest. And sometimes, depending on the company's policy, one of them might be required to quit. Historians still argue whether this system is a holdover from older, more patriarchal workplace norms, or a practical solution to preserve workplace neutrality in tightly knit teams. Either way, it reflects a society where the line between public duty and private life remains blurry. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some Japanese companies, marriage leave is built into your benefits. That's right. If you get married, you're entitled to a few days off, often paid, to settle into married life. And if your co-workers throw you a reception, it might include envelopes of cash, goshugi, and toasts more formal than anything at your actual wedding. Now imagine it. You're sitting at your desk, nervously adjusting your tie or smoothing your skirt. Your boss calls you into a meeting, not about quarterly earnings, but about your recent application to marry someone from sales. The room is quiet, papers are shuffled, then a nod. Congratulations! Just like that, your love life is officially on file. And in a culture that values group identity so highly, this kind of official recognition isn't seen as intrusive, it's seen as respectful. By telling the company, you're acknowledging that your relationship affects others, that you've thought about it, that you care. But not everyone sees it that way. Younger Japanese workers increasingly resist these formalities, arguing that their private lives shouldn't be company business. Some couples hide their relationships. Others wait to marry until one of them changes jobs. And a growing number choose not to marry at all, a trend that has sparked nationwide concern about Japan's declining birth rate and aging population. Still, the system endures. In some offices, it's relaxing. In others, it's quietly enforced. But everywhere, it's a reminder that marriage, here, is both personal and professional. You glance now at the paperwork in your hands, your name, your partner's, the date of your planned union. You sign the bottom, click your pen, and slide the form into the inter-office envelope. Somewhere down the hall, someone will read it, stamp it, file it, and just like that, your wedding becomes company policy. Later, at your desk, your phone buzzes. A calendar invite, team marriage. Congratulations, Friday, 3 p.m, light snacks provided. You smile. And beneath the bland veneer of office decorum, you feel something small, warm, and real begin to flicker. It's not fireworks, it's not a chapel, but it is, in its own quiet way, a commitment. The office fades behind you, the clicking keyboards replaced by the distant echo of hoofbeats. The rhythm is solemn, ceremonial. The floor beneath you is stone again, cold, echoing with history, and suddenly you are standing in a cathedral. But the groom? Nowhere to be seen. The bride, fully dressed, and the best man, he is the groom, in disguise. You've entered the curious and often bewildering world of marriage by proxy, where one, or sometimes both, partners are not present at the wedding. Instead, they are replaced by stand-ins, surrogates, or ceremonial representatives. The vows are spoken, the papers are signed, and the couple is declared husband and wife, even if they won't meet for months or ever. This isn't romantic, it's strategic, and throughout history it's been surprisingly common. Start in medieval Europe, where political marriages between royal houses were often too logistically complicated or too risky for everyone to show up in person. So what did they do? They sent someone else to say, "I do." The most famous example? Marie de Medici, who in 1600 married King Henry IV of France by proxy. Her uncle stood in for the groom. She wore a gown, he wore armour. They went through the entire ceremony, exchanged rings and kissed, not each other, but the air. Weeks later, she travelled to France and had a second official wedding with the real Henry. A wedding warm-up, if you will. Historians still argue whether these proxy weddings were emotionally significant or simply ceremonial necessity. For many royal women, they marked the point of no return, a symbolic crossing of a border long before physically doing so. And it wasn't limited to queens. Soldiers, explorers, and diplomats often wed by proxy when duty called. Even as late as World War II, some soldiers married sweethearts back home through letters and designated witnesses. A stand-in held the ring. The bride smiled at a stranger in uniform, and yet legally they were wed, you quirky tidbit. In some Catholic traditions, proxy marriages were allowed as long as intent was proven, meaning if you sent someone with a ring and a letter and they said the words for you, the church might honor it. This gave rise to wonderfully strange moments like a groom marrying a bride he'd never seen based only on portraits and recommendations. Now picture it. You stand beneath a vaulted ceiling. The priest begins the ceremony. You glance to your left and see not your future spouse, but a cousin, or a trusted knight, or in one bizarre case from 18th century Germany, a wax mannequin made to resemble the groom. You smile anyway. The guests cheer, the orchestra plays, and then you go home, still married to someone not in the room. But marriage by proxy isn't just ancient history. In modern times, it still happens, especially for couples separated by war, borders, or immigration laws. Several U.S. states, including Montana, still allow double proxy marriages, meaning neither party has to be present. Two surrogates sign the paperwork. The couple could be on different continents, but the law recognizes their union. Some find this bizarre, others find it practical. If love can exist across oceans, why not marriage? Still, it raises questions. Can you truly vow loyalty without looking into someone's eyes? Can a stand-in promise for you what you haven't whispered yourself? Historians still debate whether proxy marriages undermine the intimacy of the vow or simply expand the definition of commitment. In an age of Zoom, online dating, and digital signatures, the line grows ever blurrier. You walk now through the empty cathedral. The scent of frankincense lingers. The ring on your finger is real, but the hands that placed it there? Not the ones you'll wake up beside. And yet somewhere across the sea a letter arrives. A signature is notarized, a hand touches paper, and far apart, but bound, you both begin. The cathedral's echo fades into open sky, and now you're surrounded by fields, hedgerows, and the low clatter of a village cart. The air smells of turned earth and Sunday bread. You're in medieval England, where life is public and slow, and everyone knows everyone's business. And right now, everyone knows yours. Because it's time for the crying of the banns, a tradition that made your engagement a community affair whether you liked it or not. You stand outside a parish church. The priest clears his throat. Birds scatter. A few neighbours lean in from the nearby market stalls. And then, with no hint of modesty, the priest bellows your name and your betrothed's, loud enough for even the pigs in the lane to perk up. Be it known that John, son of Thomas, and Agnes, daughter of William, intend to marry. And just like that, your private plans become parish knowledge. The banns of marriage were a requirement across most of medieval Christendom. For 3 consecutive Sundays, your names would be read aloud in the church where you planned to wed, and often in your home parishes as well. The idea was simple: transparency. If anyone knew a reason why this union shouldn't happen, pre-existing marriage, consanguinity, coercion, now was the time to speak up. And yes, people sometimes did. Historians still argue whether the bans served more to protect against fraud or to reinforce social order. Probably both. In a world without centralized records or fast communication, your fellow villagers were the best defense against bigamy and other marital mischief. But the bans were more than an anti-scandal alarm. They were a signal, a kind of social permission slip, a declaration that said, "These two are off the market." Gossip adjusted accordingly. And here's your quirky tidbit. If the bans were mispronounced or someone's name was wrong, the whole process had to start over. This meant 3 more weeks of waiting, announcements, and awkward side-eyes from elderly ladies who were already picking apart your guest list. Now picture it. You're sitting in the back pew, bonnet tight, cheeks warm. The priest calls your name. You stare at your shoes. The boy next to you snickers. Outside, a rooster crows. And somewhere in the crowd, someone mutters, "Didn't she used to walk with the blacksmith's son?" In tight-knit communities, this was how rumours started, and sometimes how weddings ended. If someone objected, it could halt the process. The priest was obliged to investigate. Some objections were genuine, discovered betrothals, suspicious timelines. Others were malicious, like jealous rivals or overbearing relatives tossing wrenches into the works. Still, many couples survived the bans unscathed. And once the final Sunday passed, the wedding could proceed, usually within days. The Reformation didn't end the practice. In fact, Protestant churches embraced it, valuing its openness and community accountability. English law continued to require bans or a costly marriage license as late as the 20th century. Even now, in some Anglican churches, the tradition persists. Historians still debate how much say the community really had in a couple's fate. Were the bans truly democratic or just performative? But they undeniably gave marriage a sense of public gravity, a reminder that love wasn't just between 2 people. It was between 2 families, 2 parishes, 2 social networks that would soon be interwoven. You walk now across the village green. Someone waves. A group of boys trails behind, teasing Mrs. Soon-to-be. The baker gives you a nod. The priest's voice still echoes faintly in your ears. Your engagement is official, not by ring, not by Instagram post, but by declaration. And if you're lucky, no one stands up next Sunday with an objection and a badly timed story. Because in this world, before you could say "I do," The entire village had to say, "All right, fine." The bells of the village fall silent behind you, and as you walk forward, their echoes are replaced by a different kind of hush, a heavy, gilded quiet. The stone grows colder underfoot. You pass beneath tall archways and tapestries embroidered with lions, lilies, and eagles. You're not just marrying into a family now, you're marrying into a nation, because you are a princess, and your wedding is a diplomatic treaty dressed in silk. In courts from medieval France to imperial China, from Habsburg Austria to Ming Beijing, noble and royal marriages weren't personal milestones, they were political weapons. And often the bride was the most precious token of all. You are young, maybe 16, maybe 12. You speak one language, your future husband speaks another, you've never met. And now a fleet of men in robes are negotiating your future like it's a shipment of grain. It's not a question of if you'll marry or who. The question is, which alliance needs reinforcing? Historians still argue whether royal brides were pawns, players, or prisoners. There were women like Catherine de' Medici or Eleanor of Aquitaine who used their marriages to wield enormous influence. But many more lived quiet, dutiful lives, tasked with two things, stability and sons. And when the alliance failed, so did the woman. Sometimes in scandal, sometimes in exile. Here's your quirky tidbit. In Byzantine diplomacy, emperors would send portraits of their daughters to foreign courts, alongside samples of cloth, poems, and sometimes a lock of hair. The ambassadors would then select the most politically useful match, not necessarily the most beautiful one, despite what romantic legends say. You arrive at your new palace. Your name is changed, your clothing too. In some cases, your religion. You are gently but thoroughly transformed into a living symbol of peace between powers. But peace is fragile, and should war break out again, you might find yourself a hostage in your own home. In many royal courts, queens were watched carefully for signs of split loyalty. Some were blamed for espionage, others for infertility. You might be both beloved and distrusted simultaneously. And then there are the children. Each child you bear is not just a baby. It's an heir, a claim, a bargaining chip. Your body is the parchment on which dynasties are rewritten. And what of love? Maybe it comes, maybe it doesn't. Historians still debate whether some of these marriages grew into genuine affection. Letters suggest that a few royal couples did care deeply for one another, but many others remained cold transactional arrangements, polite in public, distant in private. You sit now in a grand chamber, 1,000 candles flickering. You wear a gown so heavy it leaves bruises, a crown that pinches. Your new husband is across the hall, speaking Latin to a bishop and French to a general. You wonder if he'll ever speak to you. Your family is hundreds of miles away. You are alone, but not invisible. Every movement, every word, every heirloom ring you wear is a message to two kingdoms the alliance holds. And even in death, your role continues. Many princesses were buried with the arms of both nations carved into their tombs, stone reminders of the unions they embodied. Marriage in this world is less about two hearts and more about two borders. You're not just a wife, you're a symbol of peace, of diplomacy, of the hope that maybe, for once, bloodlines won't lead to bloodshed. And if the treaty fails, well, they'll just marry off your niece instead. The flicker of candlelight dims. Stone turns to marble. Gold becomes white ash. You walk now through a silent temple, one that breathes incense and shadow. You're in ancient Rome again, but this time not in the world of lovers and vows. You are in the service of Vesta, and you may never marry. You are a Vestal Virgin, one of the most sacred roles in Roman society, and one of the most restrictive, because once chosen, you belong not to a husband, nor to a family, but to the state itself. Your marriage is not to a man, it is to the eternal flame of Rome. You were chosen young, between the ages of 6 and 10. Once selected, you were taken from your home, your parents kissed you goodbye, with pride or sorrow or both, and you were escorted to the house of the Vestals, adjacent to the Roman Forum. For the next 30 years, you would live within those marble walls. Your duties? Keep the sacred fire of Vesta burning at all times, guard the rituals of the goddess, maintain purity in both ritual and body. The flame represents the life of the Roman state. If it dies, it is not just a bad omen, it is a national crisis. And so are you if you fail in your vows. Because here's the brutal truth. If a Vestal is found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity, if she takes a lover or is even accused without defense, the punishment is death. Not just death, burial alive. You're led, veiled and silent, to a small underground chamber. You are given a loaf of bread, a lamp, and a jug of water, symbolic gestures of mercy. The tomb is sealed. The people look away. The city exhales. Historians still argue whether this horror was truly common or more a mythic warning. Records show that only a handful of Vestals were executed this way. Most served honorably and were richly rewarded, at least by Roman standards. After 30 years, 10 years of learning, 10 of service, 10 of teaching, you were free to leave. You could marry, but most chose not to. After all, who would be husband to a woman who once guarded the goddess? Who could compare? Here's your quirky tidbit. Vestals had privileges most Roman women could only dream of. They owned property, could free slaves, made wills, and rode in chariots. Their word carried legal weight. If you passed a condemned man on the street, he could be pardoned just by touching your robe. But those freedoms came at a price: isolation, reverence, surveillance. You were honored, but you were also watched. Now imagine yourself standing in the temple, white-robed, hair-bound with woolen bands. The sacred flame dances behind you. Citizens pass in awe. Children are hushed. Senators bow. You are untouchable. You are essential. But you are never to fall in love. Even the gods must be kept at a distance. You sleep in a chamber without locks. You speak little. You feel the eyes of Rome upon you every moment of the day. And though you serve with dignity, a part of you wonders, what would it be like to leave these walls? To light a fire not for a goddess, but for yourself? Historians still debate whether Vestals truly wanted their role or simply accepted it as their fate. For some it was a path to influence, for others a gilded prison. And for Rome? You were both shield and symbol. Proof that the city's heart never stopped burning. But even sacred flames flicker. You stand alone now, the torch in your hand. The temple is silent. The stone floor cold beneath your bare feet. You whisper a prayer, not for Rome, not for Vesta, but for yourself. And the flame dances on. The flicker of the sacred flame fades behind you, and now the air shifts, humid, perfumed, filled with jasmine and distant strings. You're in imperial China, and the walls around you are lacquered in red and gold. But today's not about silk robes or incense. Today you're looking at feet, because here, to marry well among the upper class, it's not your smile or dowry or even horoscope that matters most. It's whether you have bound feet, tiny, delicate, lotus-like feet. And if they're not naturally that way, don't worry. The process will take care of it. You're about 6 years old, your bones are still soft, and someone, your mother, your grandmother, a trusted wet nurse, will take your foot and begin bending the toes under. They're folded until they break. They're wrapped tightly in silk. They're pressed into a shape they were never meant to take. This is foot binding, a centuries-long practice designed to reshape the female foot to achieve the ideal 3-inch golden lotus. And in many dynasties, this was more than a beauty standard. It was a marriage requirement. Historians still argue whether the practice began as courtly fashion or as a method of patriarchal control. Either way, it became a symbol of femininity, discipline, and upper-class status. A woman with bound feet couldn't work in the fields. She had to be carried or walk with short swaying steps, modest, delicate, and in some circles, eroticized. For generations, families bound their daughters' feet to improve their chances of marrying up. No matter how clever or kind or educated a girl was, if her feet were large, her prospects shrank. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some families didn't just wrap the feet, they embroidered the binding cloth with love poems or filled the shoes with herbs to keep them from rotting. The smallest, most coveted shoes, tiny enough to fit in the palm of your hand, were prized like jewelry and displayed as proof of a daughter's worth. You're that daughter now. You sit on a wooden stool, your feet ache, the bones throb. But when your mother unwraps them to rebind, she smiles. "Very good," she says. "Soon they will be ready." Your future husband may never see your bare feet, but he'll see the way you walk. He'll see the shoes. He'll know you were raised to endure. Wedding proposals are arranged through go-betweens. They speak in codes and tea leaves. The matchmaker knows your name, your zodiac sign, your foot size. She brings a sample shoe to the groom's family. They test it against their expectations like Cinderella's slipper, except no one asks if you want to fit it. On your wedding day, you're carried to the groom's house in a red sedan chair. You don't walk, not just for tradition's sake, but because you can't. You are lifted over the threshold, seated beside a man you barely know, and celebrated for your beauty, your breeding, and your silence. Historians still debate whether all women despised foot binding or whether some took pride in its discipline. Diaries from the Qing dynasty reveal both. Some lamented the pain, others boasted of their perfect arches. It became a cultural paradox, pain as prestige, deformity as elegance. And it didn't end quickly. Foot binding continued well into the 20th century, despite reformers' protests. Even after being banned by the Republican government in 1912, it persisted quietly, especially in rural areas, for decades more. Only in the mid-20th century, with modernization and new legal restrictions, did the practice truly fade. But the women who bore its scars, some still living into the 21st century, carried that legacy long after their wedding days were over. You sit now by a lattice window. Your feet are bandaged. Your wedding garments are being stitched. Outside, someone rehearses a wedding song on the guzheng. It's beautiful, soothing, distant. You shift in your seat. Pain flickers through your soles. But the seamstress doesn't look up. She's too busy sewing embroidered cranes into the hem of your wedding robe, symbols of fidelity, long life, and flight. Even if you may never run again. The embroidered cranes blur, and you blink once, twice, and suddenly everything is velvet and lace. Gaslight flickers. The air smells faintly of lavender sachets and polished wood. You're in Victorian England now, in a house with high ceilings and higher expectations. And you're married, but you and your husband, you sleep in separate beds. It's not because you don't like each other. In fact, you might be perfectly fond of one another. You might even sneak a hand across the quilt on occasion. But in the Victorian ideal of marriage, modesty and morality were more important than physical closeness. The separate bed wasn't just about comfort. It was a symbol, a statement, a spatial boundary between intimacy and restraint, and in many middle and upper-class homes it became standard. You walk now into the marital bedroom, or rather bedrooms, side by side or across a hall. His room is darker, oak-panelled, with stiff collars and cologne. Yours is airy, floral, filled with books, hairpins, and the occasional fainting couch. In smaller homes, a couple might share a room, but still have twin beds, two neatly made islands of propriety with a chaste patch of rug in between. Why? A mix of reasons. For one, there were health concerns. Victorian doctors fretted over bad airs, suffocation, overheating. Sharing a bed, they believed, could spread illness, or worse, drain one partner's energy into the other. Yes, really. Historians still argue whether the separate bed trend was about hygiene, class aspiration, or simply a fear of overindulgence. It might have started as medical advice, but it quickly turned into a moral prescription. Too much marital passion, suspicious, married people enjoying themselves, positively scandalous. Here's your quirky tidbit. The Ideal Home exhibition in London, first launched in 1908, regularly featured model bedrooms for couples with separate twin beds. The designs were praised for being healthy, civilized, and modern. Nothing said successful marriage like two beds and a good cross breeze. But it wasn't always so prim. Many couples did, of course, share a bed, especially in working-class homes where space was tight and propriety came second to practicality. But in the world of etiquette manuals and silver tea trays, separation was sophistication. There was also a gendered layer to it. Victorian women were expected to be the moral centres of the home, pure, passive, above desire. A woman who actively enjoyed her married life too much. She risked being labelled unnatural. So couples performed distance. They shared schedules, not sheets. They wrote little notes, knocked gently before entering each other's private space. Marriage became a kind of polite choreography, delicate, quiet, and full of door handles turned just so. You sit now at your vanity brushing your hair. It's your wedding night. The candles are low. Your new husband knocks once, peeks in and smiles. He's wearing a dressing gown. You nod. Maybe he enters. Maybe he doesn't. If he does, he'll return to his own bed afterward, just as etiquette dictates. And in the morning you'll wake up separately, but together you'll dress, you'll breakfast, you'll walk side by side in the garden. Two souls, well aired and respectably rested. Historians still debate when the tide turned. By the mid-20th century, the shared double bed began to return, thanks to changing social norms, smaller homes, and Hollywood's influence. But even today, some couples prefer the Victorian approach, calling it a recipe for better sleep and fewer arguments. So maybe they had a point. Or maybe they were just very good at hiding their midnight rendezvous. You fluff your pillow now. The moonlight casts delicate shadows across the floral wallpaper. In the silence, you hear a second bed creak softly across the room. A breath, a turn, a pause, and the hush of two people sleeping separately, but not alone. The hush of moonlight softens, and as the wallpaper dissolves into mist, you smell something dry and unfamiliar. Ashes, maybe, or scorched wheat. You're not in a drawing room anymore. You're standing at the edge of a barren field, somewhere in early modern Europe, where superstition lingers like smoke and eyes narrow at every misstep. Because today, your marriage is in question. Not because of infidelity, not because of betrayal, but because you haven't given birth. And worse, you might be a witch. Yes, you've entered the uneasy territory where fertility and suspicion meet, and where a woman's failure to produce children or male heirs was sometimes seen as more than just misfortune. It was evidence. You are a young wife, maybe 20, maybe younger. Your wedding was quiet, respectable. The village blessed you. You wore rosemary in your braid, and the midwife patted your hand and whispered, "Soon you'll be heavy with sons." But months pass, then years. No swelling belly, no cradle, just whispers behind hedges and a growing chill when you walk through the churchyard. Historians still argue how often infertility, or simple bad luck, was used as fuel for accusations of witchcraft. In some areas, it was central to the charge. A barren woman, especially one who also brewed herbs, lived alone, or argued with her neighbours, could quickly be recast as a threat. Someone unnatural, someone dark. And it didn't end with infertility. If your husband fell sick, if your cow died, if hail flattened the barley, it might all circle back to you. A cursed marriage, surely someone cursed it, and surely the one standing beside it, day after day, was to blame. Your quirky tidbit, in parts of Scotland, it was believed that witches could tie the knots of a man's fertility, literally twist invisible cords to render him impotent. So if a marriage failed to produce children, suspicion could fall on either spouse. But it was the wife who paid the higher price. You stand now outside your cottage. A neighbour passes and doesn't meet your eyes. A child clutches her mother's skirts as she walks by. You look down at your hands. They are clean. You have done nothing wrong. But someone left an old doll on your doorstep, its arms bound in string, its mouth sewn shut. You pick it up and say nothing. Even the church is cautious. A priest may offer a blessing, may suggest fasting or prayer, or worse, urge your husband to reconsider the match. In some regions, a man could seek annulment on the grounds of barrenness, even if no medical cause was ever found. Your value was directly tied to your womb, and if you did have children, but only daughters, that too could bring judgment. The line is weak, they'd whisper. The gods are not pleased. Or worse, she must have meddled with fate. Historians still debate whether these beliefs were grassroots fears or top-down church policies twisted by folklore. But the line between theological failure and supernatural guilt was thin, and women walked it barefoot. You sit by the fire, it's late, the room is quiet, your husband is asleep, or maybe gone, or maybe he never said anything at all, just stopped looking at you the same way. You remember the rosemary in your hair, the songs sung on your wedding day. You listen to the wind and wonder if it's the sound of justice or accusation, because in this world, when a marriage failed to grow, so often you were the one left to wither. The wind outside your cottage fades, replaced by the rhythmic scratching of quill on parchment and the soft rustle of tax forms stacked on an oak desk. You blink, and the dim hearthlight becomes fluorescent white. Now you're not in the 1600s, you're in a tidy office in Napoleonic France or perhaps mid-century America. And this time, the weirdness isn't in the vows or the rituals, it's in the math. Because in this part of history, marriage is a tax strategy, and sometimes a very confusing one. Depending on where and when you live, being married could save you a fortune or cost you dearly. Take Napoleon, for example. The man didn't just reorganize France with swords, he did it with spreadsheets. His civil code, established in 1804, wasn't just about rights and duties. It also introduced rules about property ownership, inheritance, and tax liability between spouses. Marriage, under his rule, was a financial contract as much as a moral one. A husband had legal control over most family property, and the wife, well, she might be listed as usufructuary. Someone who can use the property, but not truly own it. Romantic. Fast forward to 20th century America, where a couple marrying in the 1950s might find themselves tangled in something equally convoluted, the marriage penalty, or, depending on the year, the marriage bonus. You and your spouse file taxes jointly. If one of you earns far more than the other, you might benefit, but if you both earn similar incomes, suddenly your tax bracket leaps upward. You thought marriage was a personal milestone. The IRS thinks it's a fiscal anomaly. Historians still argue whether these tax rules were designed to favor traditional households, single earners, usually male, or whether they were simply the accidental byproduct of clunky policy design. Either way, they shaped choices. Some couples delayed marriage. Others stayed legally single for tax reasons, even with kids and shared mortgages. Your quirky tidbit. In the 1970s, a famous New York Times article profiled the couple who refuses to marry because of the IRS. They were dubbed the tax refusers, and they weren't alone. Financial advisors began including marriage math in pre-wedding consultations. Love? Yes, but let's talk about your W-4 first. And it wasn't just America. In Germany, a married couple could opt for splitting, where one spouse's income is halved and applied to both. Massive savings if one partner earns significantly more. In Scandinavia, where equality is prioritized, couples are taxed individually, marriage or not. And in Japan, women who earn above a certain income threshold can lose access to spousal benefits, creating a quiet pressure to cap their ambitions. Now imagine it. You're sitting at the dining table, surrounded by forms. You love your partner. You want to share a life. But the accountant clears his throat and says, if you wait until next April, you'll save $4,200. You glance across the table. Your fiancé raises an eyebrow. The romance is still there, somewhere beneath the spreadsheets. Marriage in this world isn't a ritual. It's a status category, one that affects your taxes, your insurance, your loan eligibility, and sometimes your student aid. Even divorce gets in on the act. In some jurisdictions, alimony and custody arrangements are shaped not just by income, but by filing status. Whether or not you ever shared a toothbrush, the system will still want receipts. Historians still debate whether modern tax systems reflect social values or simply shape them. But it's clear that for centuries, marriage has been not just an emotional decision, but a financial calculation. You look down now at the final form: filing status single, married, head of household. You circle the answer with a pen, not with your heart, but with your calculator. And then you fold it up and wonder, not for the first time, what marriage might feel like if no one had to quantify it. The numbers on the tax form dissolve into swirling ink, the paper turning to parchment in your hands. The hum of fluorescent lights fades into mountain wind and goat bells. You are in northern Albania now, where time feels carved in stone, and the rules of marriage are etched even deeper. But here, you are an exception, because you are a sworn virgin, and you will never marry. Not because no one asked, not because you weren't allowed, but because you chose to become a man. Among the tribes of Albania's rugged highlands, particularly under the Kanun, a centuries-old set of traditional laws that governed everything from property to blood feuds, women had few rights, no land ownership, no voice in councils, no vote in tribal decisions, and certainly no say in marriage, unless they swore an oath. By declaring yourself a sworn virgin, you renounced marriage, sexuality, and motherhood. In return, you were granted the status of a man. You could wear trousers, carry weapons, own land, smoke, drink Reiki, and sit at the head of the table. And just like that, the chains of gender were loosened, but only if you were willing to trade your future family for freedom. Historians still argue whether this tradition was liberating, repressive, or a strange fusion of both. For some, it was a noble path, chosen to escape forced marriages, protect family honor, or step into a father's role when no sons remained. For others, it was a painful compromise, born of necessity. Your quirky tidbit? The oath was made before 12 village elders, and once sworn, could never be undone. No matter your feelings, your future, or your regrets, you would remain celibate for life. If you broke the vow, you brought shame not only on yourself, but your entire bloodline. You rise now with a hand on your belt, your hair cropped, your shoulders squared. The men in the village greet you with respect. The women avert their eyes. You are neither bride nor matron. You are a living contradiction, honored, feared, understood, alone. You walk through the market and haggle for goods. You argue politics. You speak loudly, smoke harsh cigarettes, laugh in the way only men are allowed to laugh here. And yet, when the weddings happen, you stand at the edge of the circle, watching, always watching. You'll never wear the red veil, never carry the copper basin, never sing the wedding laments passed from grandmother to granddaughter, and that's the price of sovereignty. In some villages you were celebrated, in others merely tolerated, but you existed outside the rules. You were a loophole made flesh. By the 20th century, sworn virgins had dwindled. As modernization reached the mountains, the rigid structures of Kanun law softened. Women began to find new paths to power that didn't require renunciation, but a few remained. Even today, a handful survive, elderly, stoic, dressed in vests and caps, their stories fading like smoke in mountain air. Historians still debate whether their lives were empowering acts of resistance or deeply lonely sacrifices. Probably both. You sit now on a flat rock overlooking the valley. The wind tugs at your jacket. Below, you hear wedding music, pipes, drums, laughter. You do not go down. You do not follow. You chose your place. You carved it with silence. And in a world that once gave you only one script, you wrote a different one. No husband, no home of your own, no cradle by the hearth, but the right to remain standing when all others knelt. The wind over the Albanian valley still hums in your ears, but the melody begins to shift, softer now, layered with the solemn tones of bells echoing off marble columns. You open your eyes in medieval France or perhaps Byzantine Constantinople, where incense curls through vaulted halls and choristers sing in languages older than the stone beneath your feet. You're here for a wedding, but not the kind you think. Because today, it's not a man and a woman standing before the altar. It's two men, and yes, it's real. You've stepped into the veiled, often overlooked world of same-sex unions before the modern era. Rituals that didn't always call themselves marriage, but carried its echoes, spiritual, legal, emotional. Historians still argue fiercely about the nature of these ceremonies. Were they romantic, platonic, secret codes for forbidden love? One of the most cited examples comes from early Christian liturgies in Eastern Orthodox regions, the Adelphopoiesis, literally brother-making. Performed in churches by clergy, these ceremonies united two men in spiritual brotherhood. The rite involved shared prayers, the joining of right hands, circling the altar, and the exchange of a kiss. The language of love, commitment, and shared life was unmistakable. Was it a workaround for same-sex desire, or a purely symbolic friendship bond, spiritual and chaste? The truth is blurred, as truth often is. Some believe these ceremonies offered a culturally sanctioned way for men to form deep, exclusive partnerships, especially in eras where heterosexual marriage was compulsory, but affection between men had to hide in plain sight. Your quirky tidbit: in 14th century Bosnia, legal documents survive naming male couples as mutual heirs, cohabiting partners, and even joined in the manner of marriage. Their union wasn't always celebrated, but it was recorded. Elsewhere, we see similar traces. In medieval China, contractual brotherhoods sometimes resembled lifelong partnerships. In parts of early modern Europe, some men entered into legal arrangements to live together, share assets, and exclude others, domestic unions in everything but name. And while the language used was often ambiguous, the intent was often unmistakably clear: this person is my life's companion. Now picture yourself in one of those ancient chapels. You and your partner kneel side by side, a candle burns, the priest chants, no one says husband, no one says wife. But your hands are joined, your hearts are spoken for. You may not be allowed to marry in the modern legal sense, but in this moment you are bound. Of course, not all communities accepted such unions. In many places and periods, same-sex love was criminalized, pathologized, or punished. But even in these hostile times, people found ways to bend the rules, rewrite the language, carve out space for love where there was none. Historians still debate whether these unions were widespread or rare exceptions, whether they were spiritual loopholes or full-throated declarations. But their existence leaves behind a quiet legacy, a whisper in the archives, a line in a will, a hand-painted icon showing two saints embraced. Even in the margins, love persists. You walk now through a cloister garden, your partner at your side. There are no children waiting at home, no family name to pass on, but there is shared labor, shared prayers, shared silence. You patch the roof together, press wine from grapes together, bury your parents one by one together. And when the time comes, someday, decades from now, you'll be buried together too. Because marriage, in the end, is not just what laws permit or churches declare. It is what two people hold sacred, even when the world looks away. And now, the cloister garden dims. The bells fade. The stone beneath your feet softens into loam. You find yourself beneath tall, whispering trees, somewhere ancient, somewhere sacred. The wedding is over, the law books are shut. And here, in the forest of forgotten vows, we arrive at the strangest marriage law of all, because once, in the not-so-distant past, you could marry someone who never spoke, someone who never moved, someone who was already dead. Yes. You're about to attend a posthumous wedding. This isn't fiction. In France, as recently as the 20th century, posthumous marriage, or mariage posthume, was not only possible, but legal. It was mostly used in cases of war where a soldier died before the ceremony could take place. A grieving fiancée could petition the President of France, and if approved, she would legally become the widow of a man already gone. The marriage certificate would read his name, her name, the date. His body might lie buried in a distant trench. Her bouquet might rest on a stone, but the bond would be recognized by the state. And in return, she received more than closure. She received legal rights, pensions, inheritance, and the ability to bear his name. The roots of this practice go deeper, though. In parts of China, for centuries, families arranged ghost marriages, binding a living person to a dead one, sometimes even arranging a union between two deceased individuals. These ghost weddings were not romantic gestures. They were about social harmony, ancestral balance, and securing proper rituals. A family without descendants was considered spiritually vulnerable, so even the dead were not spared the expectations of matrimony. Sometimes paper effigies were burned. Other times graves were exhumed to unite lovers, or complete an arranged match that had been agreed upon before death. Your quirky tidbit? In one 2016 case, police in northern China arrested grave robbers who sold female corpses on the black market for use in ghost weddings. Yes, actual corpse matchmaking. You probably didn't expect that in your wedding planner. Historians still argue whether these customs were about grief, economics, or cosmic duty, but they all revolve around a central theme: marriage as a necessity, even beyond the grave. You walk now through a quiet grove. A small table is set. One chair is empty. You sit in the other, dressed in mourning white. Across from you sits no one, and yet the vows are whispered. The incense curls. The contract is signed. You rise. You are now a wife, or a husband, or a ghost, or all three. In the eyes of the village, of the law, of the ancestors, you are married. You won't share a home, but perhaps you'll share memory. You won't share a bed, but perhaps you'll share story. And maybe that's the final secret to all of this, the long, strange tale of marriage laws through time. They were never just about taxes or heirs or dowries. They were about meaning, control sometimes, power often, but always meaning, even when strange, even when sad, even when beautiful in a way that only history can be. You close your eyes now. The forest grows still. The chairs disappear. The parchment curls. The marriage dissolves. And the world once again becomes quiet. You're still here. The journey is over now, but the air holds echoes of it, like faint music trailing down a hallway long after the musicians have gone. Take a breath, not a deep one, just enough to feel your chest rise. Let your shoulders ease. Let your jaw unclench. Let the oddities of history melt into the background like candlelight fading on old parchment. You've travelled far tonight, walked through altars and alleys, courtyards and courtrooms. You've worn veils of every colour, signed documents in every language, stood beside strangers and soulmates. Some of those unions felt distant, others oddly familiar. But now there are no more brides, no grooms, no witnesses, no scrolls, just you, and the soft rhythm of your breath, and the gentle weight of your blanket, and a quiet reminder that the past, no matter how strange or tangled, always ends here, folded into silence. There's nothing more to learn tonight, no law left to ponder, no loophole to unravel. The weddings have all been performed, the guests have all gone home, and you're already halfway there. Floating, so rest, dreamer, let history keep watch tonight.